Every soldier who entered the chamber did the same thing. They looked at the woman standing at the center, the woman who had spent the night bleeding, being carried across 6 kilometers of dead rock on the back of a stranger, and they knelt, every one of them. And Beckett Gray, covered in dust and alien blood that was not his own, finally understood who he had been carrying. 12 hours earlier, his biggest problem had been a missing survey beacon. By the time the third warning pulse flashed across his wrist console, Beckett Gray had already decided to ignore it. On most worlds, that kind of decision got a person killed. On Narth 9, it usually only got a person dusty irritated and slightly more convinced that the universe carried a personal grudge against him. He climbed the last ridge anyway, boots scraping against black stone still warm from the twin moon's fading light, and looked down into the canyon where his survey beacon was supposed to be blinking. It was not blinking. It was gone. He stood there in silence for a long moment, the wind hissing through crystal spines jutting from the cliffs like the ribs of something ancient and enormous that had died mid-scream. Excellent, he thought. I always wondered what part of my life was still too convenient. His name had once appeared on proper mission rosters attached to respected expeditions out of Fort Huachuca, joint operations with agencies whose names required clearance levels, survey coordination for deep-range reconnaissance teams that mapped terrain on worlds the public was not supposed to know existed. But that was before budgets collapsed, before commanders lied to congressional oversight and let good men carry the weight of decisions made in briefing rooms they were never invited into. Before Beckett had discovered that frontier survey work on dead planets required less paperwork and fewer conversations with men who enjoyed using words like strategic sacrifice, as though those words had never tasted like blood. Now it was just him. A small shuttle half buried in a ravine 2 kilometers west, a contract to scan ancient ruins no one understood for people who paid late and asked questions that proved they had not read his previous reports. 40 million miles from Tucson, 40 million miles from the apartment he no longer rented, the career he no longer had, and the version of himself that had once believed the chain of command meant something. His wrist console pulsed again. Not a beacon failure this time. The readout shifted to a frequency he had not seen in months. Energy surge. Fresh. Close. Very close. He straightened and stared toward the far end of the canyon, where the black rock narrowed into a throat of jagged pillars and collapsed alien architecture. A pale blue glow flickered behind a wall of broken stone, followed by a deep metallic groan that rolled through the ground under his boots and settled somewhere behind his ribs. Not thunder, not seismic activity. Something had come down. Hard. He should have turned around. Any sensible person would have returned to the shuttle, filed a report, and let someone with combat drones and better insurance deal with it. That was procedure. That was survival. That was what a man with nothing left to prove should do when the ground shook and the sky bled strange light on a planet that had been dead for longer than human civilization had been drawing on cave walls. Unfortunately, sensible people rarely ended up alone on dead planets, and Beckett Gray had stopped being sensible around the same time he stopped believing that anyone was coming to help. So he went. The canyon narrowed into a maze of fractured black pillars and half-buried structures shaped as though they had been grown rather than built. Their surfaces still held faint silver lines that glowed when he passed, reacting to his movement with the slow awareness of something waking one reluctant nerve at a time. He had seen this technology on 7 other ruin sites across the outer systems. Never understood it. Never met anyone who did. The structures simply existed, older than any recorded species, humming with a patience that made human ambition feel like a tantrum. His scanner chirped with confused little sounds, the same tone it always made when it had no idea what it was looking at and wanted to sound professional anyway. Then he smelled it: ionized metal, hot circuitry, atmosphere burning at the edges, the specific chemical signature of a vessel that had entered atmosphere at speed and met the ground before it was ready. A craft had slammed into the rock wall at a steep angle, cutting a bright scar across the canyon floor that still glowed faintly at the edges. And it was unlike any ship he had ever seen in 12 years of military and contract service. Sleek, curved, almost organic. Its hull shifted between dark violet and reflective silver as though it could not commit to being seen. One side had been torn open with surgical violence. Blue sparks snapped and crawled from exposed conduits like dying insects. The air hummed around it with a frequency he could feel in his teeth. He crouched behind a slab of fallen stone and watched for movement. Nothing. No soldiers, no automated defense swarm, no cheerful synthetic voice announcing trespasser identification and vaporization countdown in 6 languages. Just the ship bleeding light into the dark. Then he heard it, a strained breath, soft, uneven, close enough and human enough to make him move before caution could catch up with his legs. He climbed into the wreck through the split hull. Emergency lighting stuttered across the interior in thin strips of dying blue. The cockpit, if it could be called that, was a curved space of seamless panels and crystalline interfaces, most of them shattered. Navigation projections still flickered in midair, showing trajectories that ended in sharp red termination points. Whoever had been flying this ship had been running from something and had run out of sky. The air inside was different from the thin canyon atmosphere. Warmer, charged with a faint electrical sweetness that he could taste on his tongue. Somewhere in the wreck, a system was still trying to function, cycling through emergency protocols in a language of light and sound that his equipment could not translate. Warning tones played at intervals, soft and musical, as though the ship was mourning its own death, with a dignity that human engineering had never achieved. He found her half collapsed beside a shattered control cradle, one hand pressed hard against her side fingers, white with pressure. For a full second, his brain refused to process what his eyes were delivering. She looked like a woman from Earth seen through the memory of a dream. Tall, fine-boned, silver hair tangled over one shoulder and catching the emergency light like strands of mercury. Pale skin with a faint blue luminescence threading beneath it in slow pulses like hidden constellations mapping a circulatory system that did not belong to any species in his training manuals. Her ears were slightly elongated, elegant, rather than strange, and her features held a symmetry that felt less like beauty and more like mathematics. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They fixed on him with such sharp, immediate awareness that he nearly took a step backward. The gaze of someone who had been hunted long enough to stop wasting energy on surprise and had moved directly into assessment. She looked at him the way a general looks at a map, measuring, deciding. "You took your time," she said. Her voice was steady despite the blood, clear despite the damage around her. It carried an accent he could not place, every consonant precise, every syllable weighted, as though language itself was a tool she had been trained to use with surgical efficiency. He blinked. "I am sorry. Next time I will sprint toward the exploding spacecraft." She studied him for 2 full seconds. Then the corner of her mouth moved by approximately 1 millimeter. "Are you armed?" Moderately useful or emotionally, her expression did not change. He sighed, pulled the compact plasma cutter from his belt, and held it up. It was a survey tool designed for cutting rock samples and occasionally opening stubborn supply crates. In a firefight, it ranked somewhere between a sharp stick and aggressive optimism. "Useful enough," he said. She gave one nod. "Then help me stand." He glanced at the wound on her side. If it was blood, it shimmered too brightly in the flashing light. Silver blue, almost luminous. Unlike arterial red, unlike anything he had been trained to treat at Fort Huachuca or any forward medical station afterward. "That request feels ambitious," he said. "They will find this crash site soon. Who will—" Her jaw tightened. A flicker of something passed through those sharp eyes. Something older than fear, heavier than caution. "People I do not wish to have another conversation with." That clears up almost nothing. It should clear up enough. She was right, it did. The details did not matter yet. What mattered was the tone of her voice when she said another conversation. Not a first encounter, a continuation. Whatever was hunting her had been doing it long enough to establish a relationship. Another pulse ran through the dying ship. Somewhere overhead, a system failed with a sound like a mechanical scream. He knelt beside her and let the scanner pass over her side. The readings made no sense. Tissue densities he had never seen. A second thread of circulation running parallel to the first. Internal structures that his equipment labeled with symbols instead of words. "You are injured," he said. I had noticed, she replied. That observation was for my benefit. I like to narrate disasters. It keeps morale from collapsing entirely. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, expecting resistance. She tensed for a fraction of a second, then allowed it. Up close, the luminescence beneath her skin was more visible. Thin threads of pale blue light tracing patterns along her collarbone and up the side of her neck. Something biological, something alive. He helped her sit upright. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who had trained her body to function through damage. Not the movement of a civilian, and not quite a soldier's either. Something else entirely suggesting that the concept of enduring pain was neither new to her, nor something she had ever been permitted to show. "Can you walk?" he asked. "For a short distance," she said. "That answer usually means no. It means you will complain less if I allow myself to try first." He could not help it. Despite the wreck, the blood, the unknown danger circling somewhere in the dark above them, he smiled. "You have been conscious for 30 seconds, and you are already the most difficult person on this planet." Her eyes held his. "And yet you are still helping me." He got her to her feet. She swayed once. He caught her before she fell, his arm around her waist, her weight settling against him with the reluctant surrender of someone who despised needing support, but understood the mathematics of survival well enough to accept it. The ship groaned again, louder. The structural warnings were no longer polite suggestions. They were final statements. He made the decision for both of them, turned, crouched, hooked her arms over his shoulders. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Saving us both time." "Get on." There was a pause, a real one. Not theatrical, not dramatic. The silence of a woman who was not accustomed to being carried and was recalculating her understanding of the situation to accommodate it. "You cannot carry me for long," she said. "That is a wonderfully supportive thing to say to the man who is about to carry you." She settled onto his back, lighter than he expected. Or maybe adrenaline had opinions about physics tonight. Her arms tightened around his shoulders with careful strength, enough to hold, not enough to restrict. Then she spoke again, and her voice changed. It did not grow softer or louder. It simply shifted from the voice of a woman being rescued into the voice of someone who had decided to take command of the rescue. "Self, west-northwest. Stay below the ridgeline. There are sensor-reflective deposits in the rock face at 40 meters that will scatter any aerial sweep. Do not stop until I tell you." He turned his head slightly. "You seem to know a great deal about a planet you crashed on 10 minutes ago." "Move," she said, "now." And something in that single word made his legs obey before his brain finished processing the sentence. Not volume, not anger. Authority. The kind that did not ask for compliance because it had never once needed to. So he moved. The first kilometer was manageable. Adrenaline carried most of the weight, and the terrain offered stretches of flat black stone between the ridges where he could settle into something resembling a pace. She was lighter than he expected. That helped. But the air was thin enough to remind him every few minutes that human lungs were not designed for this altitude, and the boots he was wearing had been purchased from a surplus catalog specifically because they were cheap, not because they were suited for sprinting across volcanic rock while carrying a passenger who bled starlight. She guided him through every meter of it. "Turn left at the next formation. Stay in the shadow of the western wall. There is a drainage channel ahead. It will provide cover for approximately 300 meters." He did not question her directions. Every instinct in his body told him she was right, and every time he verified against his scanner, she was. She knew this terrain the way a person knows the hallways of the house they grew up in. She knew it in her body, in her bones, in whatever biological architecture allowed her to sense topography and threat patterns from the back of a man she had met 20 minutes ago. When drone lights appeared on the horizon, pale dots moving in patient formation against the dark sky, she told him to stop before he saw them. "Down, behind the pillar. Do not move." He pressed himself against the base of a fractured stone column and held his breath. The drone passed overhead, its scanning beam sweeping the ground 30 meters to the east, close enough that he could feel the faint electrical charge it left in the air. She did not move. She did not tense. She waited with the practiced stillness of someone who had been hunted before and knew that survival was not about speed but about timing. "It is clear," she said. "Continue west-northwest. The next kilometer has exposed ground. Move quickly." He moved quickly, or as quickly as a man could move, while carrying another person across a landscape that seemed specifically designed to punish human ankles. The black stone was uneven, ridged, cracked in patterns that caught his boot soles at bad angles. Twice he stumbled. Both times she shifted her weight to compensate before he could fall, the adjustment so precise it felt rehearsed. The second kilometer nearly killed his resolve. The ridge steepened and the thin air turned from an inconvenience into an adversary. Each breath felt like it was being filtered through gauze. His heart rate climbed into territory that his military training would have flagged as concerning, and his legs began producing a specific kind of burn that meant they were running out of cooperation. She felt it immediately. Your breathing pattern has changed. You are approaching your functional limit. Thank you for the clinical assessment of my suffering. Redirect energy from speech to movement. There is a rock overhang at 160 meters. We can rest there for 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Exactly 90 seconds. She calculated recovery time the way a general calculated ammunition expenditure, with precision and without sentiment. They rested under the overhang. He leaned against the stone chest, heaving sweat running down his temples, despite the cold. She remained on his back, her weight settled against him, her breathing close to his ear. For a moment in the dark under the rock, with the wind hissing above them and the distant drone lights wheeling against the sky, they were simply two people trying to survive. The strangeness of her, the impossibility of the situation, none of it mattered as much as the fundamental arithmetic of putting one foot in front of the other. Your heart rate, she said, is my business. It is my business when it determines whether I reach shelter. He almost laughed. You are without question the most demanding person I have ever carried. You have carried others, not voluntarily. The 90 seconds ended. She did not announce it. She simply adjusted her grip on his shoulders, and he understood that it was time to move again. The third and fourth kilometers blurred together in a haze of exertion and her voice. She spoke less frequently now, conserving her own strength. But when she did speak, every word mattered. She anticipated the terrain. She anticipated the drones. She anticipated the moments when his pace would falter and redirected him to easier ground before his legs made the decision to stop. He began to understand that she was not simply directing him. She was managing him the way a commander manages a critical asset, monitoring his output, adjusting the route to extend his operational range, making calculations about human physiology that were remarkably accurate for someone who was not human. At the 5-kilometer mark, his legs began to shake, not from her weight, from the accumulated punishment of running across volcanic rock in survey boots, designed for walking, not sprinting through alien canyons with mysterious bleeding women on his back. She felt it immediately. Your pace is declining, thank you. I had not noticed that my legs were attempting to resign. There is a structure ahead, buried under the eastern ridge. Approach from the shadow side. He looked up. The ridge loomed above them, black glass rock reflecting the fading light of twin moons. He could see nothing that resembled a structure. No door, no entrance. Just rock and the metallic vines that grew everywhere on this planet twitching whenever the wind changed direction, as though they were nervous about something they refused to name. I do not see anything, he said. You will, she replied. Her voice was weaker now. The blood loss was catching up with the authority. Both of them knew it. He found the recess in the rock face exactly where she said it would be. A doorway hidden behind a curtain of those twitching metallic vines carved into stone, so old it made the ruins above look like recent construction. He pressed his palm against the corroded access plate. Nothing happened. He hit it harder. Still nothing. The ancient system stared back at him with the indifference of technology that had outlived everyone who understood it. Then Saralyn, without lifting her head from where it rested against his shoulder, reached past him with one trembling hand and tapped 3 glowing symbols hidden beneath the corrosion. Not randomly, not searching. She touched them in sequence with the precision and confidence of someone opening her own front door after a long day. The shelter hummed awake. Locks disengaged one by one inside the wall, each one releasing with a sound like a held breath, finally exhaled. Beckett turned his head just enough to look at her face. Her eyes were half closed. Pain had drawn lines around her mouth that had not been there an hour ago. Interesting, he said. I guess, she whispered. You guessed an extinct security code on a planet no one has visited in centuries. I am intuitive. That is the most suspicious sentence I have heard in my entire career. And I once worked for the United States government. The door parted with a sigh, exhaling cold, stale air that smelled of ozone and old circuitry and time measured in quantities that made human calendars look like napkin math. He stepped inside and nearly laughed from relief. The chamber was intact. Emergency lights flickered awake in strips along the floor, revealing curved walls lined with alien storage module, dormant equipment bays, and a central power core blinking with the exhausted patience of a machine that had spent eons waiting for someone who actually knew what they were doing. Home sweet, terrifying bunker, he said. He lowered her carefully onto a padded platform that his scanner identified as medical, or possibly ceremonial. On this planet, furniture had a disturbing habit of turning out to be religious. The chamber itself was more than he had dared to hope for. Beyond the medical platform, he could see storage modules lining the curved walls, their surfaces etched with the same silver patterns that ran through the ruins above. Power conduits traced the ceiling in geometric networks. A central core blinked at the far end of the room with the exhausted patience of a machine that had spent eons waiting for someone who actually knew what they were doing. The air was cold, the kind of cold that accumulates over centuries in a sealed space pressing against the walls like a physical substance. But it was secure. That was what mattered. The walls were thick, the door was sealed, and whatever was circling above them would have to go through several meters of stone and ancient engineering to reach them. Cereline leaned back against the dark surface. Silver hair spilled around her like liquid metal. Her face was drawn tight from pain, her breathing shallow, her left hand still pressed against the wound. But even now, even half-conscious and bleeding onto ancient alien technology, she carried an air of control so complete it felt structural. Like removing it would cause her to collapse, not physically, but conceptually. She reminded him of certain officers he had served under. Not the ones who shouted, the ones who never needed to. The ones whose composure was not a mask, but a load-bearing wall, and removing it would bring down everything they had built above it. He crouched beside what appeared to be a medical console and began studying symbols he could not read. Geometric patterns, layered interfaces, a language designed for minds that thought in dimensions he could not visualize. All right, he said. Good news, there is medical equipment. Bad news, it appears to communicate exclusively in advanced geometry. She did not open her eyes. Activate the lower ring, then the blue interface. Third symbol from the left on the secondary tier. He followed her instructions exactly. The console bloomed into a smooth holographic field of rotating text and anatomical projections. You keep being useful in very specific ways, he said quietly. You keep noticing, she replied. The scanner passed over her body and began translating the damage into layered anatomical displays that rotated slowly above the platform. The projections looked human until they did not. There were differences beneath the surface that his military medical training had no framework for. Lattice-like fibers woven between muscle groups, providing structural reinforcement that human biology could not replicate. A second thread of circulation glowing beneath the first, carrying something that was not quite blood and not quite light. Neural pathways that branched in patterns his equipment compared to crystalline growth rather than organic development. And then there was the structure near her ribs, larger than a fist, dense, luminous, connected to both circulatory systems and threaded into her neural network, with a complexity that made the rest of her extraordinary biology look simple by comparison. The medical system labeled it in a language he could not read. His translator rendered it with a two-word phrase that landed in his mind like a stone dropped into still water. Crown node. He stared at the display for a long time. Then he looked at her. You have some very unusual internal architecture, he said carefully. Her eyes opened. She looked at the display. Then she looked at him. And for the first time since he had found her, something shifted behind those sharp, luminous eyes. Recognition. The understanding that a boundary had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. So do you, she said. Humans store stress in the shoulders and poor decisions in the face. He tried to smile, half managed it. What is a crown node silence? The medical system continued its work, blue threads of light beginning to seal the wound on her side. She watched the ceiling. He watched her. It is none of your concern, she said. That answer tells me it is very much my concern. Her gaze shifted to him, direct, measuring, The same look she had given him in the wreck, but deeper now, as though she was deciding how much truth he could carry without breaking under its weight. "Forget what you have seen on that display," she said quietly, "for your own protection. In my experience, that sentence has never once been followed by anything that made a person safer." She almost smiled. Almost. The ghost of it passed across her mouth and vanished. Then she closed her eyes and let the medical system work, and Beckett stood in the blue light of the ancient bunker and tried very hard to forget the two words his translator had given him, and failed completely. Crown node. He did not know what it meant. Not yet. But his instincts, the ones that had kept him alive through 3 deployments and 4 years of solo survey work on worlds that wanted him dead, those instincts were telling him something with increasing urgency because of the way she had looked at him when she realized he had seen it. Not angry, not afraid, sorry, as though knowing what lived inside her was a burden she would not wish on anyone. He sealed the bunker entrance and checked the external monitoring systems. The feeds were ancient but functional. Grainy projections showed the canyon above them in pale blue wireframe. And there, moving across the ridge in perfect formation, 3 lights descended from the skyline, drones, elegant, deadly, sweeping the terrain with scanning beams that cut through the dark like surgical instruments. Their hulls carried no markings he recognized. Too advanced for mercenaries, too quiet for standard military operations, too precise for anything he had encountered in his years of government service. They moved like predators that had never once been told no. He killed the brighter lights in the bunker. The chamber dimmed to a low blue pulse. The medical system continued its work in silence, blue threads stitching flesh that was not quite flesh. Saraline's eyes opened in the dark. She did not need to see the feed. She already knew. "They are here," she said. "Yes. How many 3 aerial units? Formation sweep, grid pattern? They will cover this ridge within the hour." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that landed in the silence like a door closing. "They are not searching randomly. They are following my signal." He looked at her. "Your signal. Every member of my kind emits a biological frequency when wounded. It is faint. Most technology cannot detect it. But the technology following me is not most technology." The drones passed overhead. The walls vibrated softly. Dust sifted from the ceiling. Beckett watched the external feed and said nothing. The questions were piling up now, stacking on top of each other like ammunition he could not yet fire. Who she was. What she was. Why machines of that sophistication were hunting a single wounded woman across a dead planet. What lived inside her ribs that an ancient medical system called a crown node, and she called none of your concern. He kept the plasma cutter in his hand. It felt absurd. Taking on that kind of hardware with a survey tool was like trying to frighten a warship with an irritated flashlight. But he kept it anyway. Because somewhere between the wreck and this bunker, between the weight of her on his back and the precision of her voice in his ear, something had shifted inside him that he could not name and did not want to examine too closely. Not affection, not obligation, something older. The same instinct that had made him enlist at 19, that had made him walk into burning wreckage in places whose names were classified, that had made him believe once that protecting someone who could not protect themselves was not just duty, but identity. He had buried that instinct years ago, buried it under cynicism and solitude, and the comfortable lie that caring about outcomes was a luxury he could no longer afford. But here in the dark, with alien drones overhead and a woman who bled silver light and spoke like an empire, the grave he had dug for that instinct turned out to be shallower than he thought. The drones circled. The bunker held. And Beckett Gray stood guard over a woman whose name he barely knew on a planet that had been dead for longer than his species had been alive, and understood with quiet clarity that whatever happened next, the man who walked out of this canyon would not be the same one who had walked in, if he walked out at all. The drones circled the ridge for 47 minutes. Beckett counted every one of them because counting was the only thing keeping him from thinking about the phrase crown node and the look in her eyes when she had told him to forget it. He was not going to forget it. They both knew that. But the fiction was useful the way all good fictions are useful. It allowed them to occupy the same small space without addressing the enormous truth sitting between them like an uninvited guest at a dinner party. Saralyn had not spoken since the drones appeared. She lay on the medical platform with her eyes closed, while the ancient system stitched her wound with threads of blue light, so fine they were nearly invisible. Her breathing had steadied. The silver blue blood had stopped flowing, but the glow beneath her skin had not dimmed. If anything, it had intensified, the pale threads tracing her veins burning brighter as her body healed, as though recovery for her species involved becoming more visible rather than less, an inconvenient trait for someone being hunted. Then she opened her eyes and sat up in a single controlled motion, as though pain was a suggestion she had decided to decline. "Show me the terrain map," she said. He gestured toward the ancient console. I activated what I could. Most of the displays speak in shapes I did not study in school. She swung her legs off the platform, stood, and walked to the console without swaying. An hour ago, she had been unable to stand without his support. Now she moved with the precise economy of someone who had simply decided that being wounded was no longer on her schedule. He watched her. "You heal quickly. I heal adequately." That was faster than adequately. That was aggressively fast. She did not respond. Her fingers moved across the console with a fluency that made his stomach tighten. She touched each symbol with recognition, with the muscle memory of someone who had used this interface before, or one so similar that the difference did not matter. The holographic terrain map bloomed above the console. The canyon appeared in blue wireframe. The three drones showed as bright points circling the ridge in a tightening pattern. Their search grid was methodical, patient, the geometry of hunters who knew their quarry was close and felt no urgency because they believed escape was already impossible. Saralyn studied the map for 10 seconds. Then her hands moved again. Panels slid open in the walls around them. Not storage compartments. Defense nodes. Small, dark, covered in centuries of dust, each one housing a lens that adjusted with insect-like clicks as power reached them for the first time in an age that predated human writing. Beckett stared at the walls as they revealed themselves. "You keep doing that," he said. "Doing what?" "Acting as though every extinct system in this sector personally owes you a favor." A faint line appeared between her brows. The expression was closer to the look a person gives when they are deciding how long they can maintain a lie that is already developing cracks. "You asked too many questions," she said. "I asked exactly the number of questions a man should ask when his injured passenger casually transforms a fossilized bunker into a military installation." She did not answer. Instead, she activated another layer of the holographic display, and the terrain map expanded to show a wider view of the canyon system. Beneath the surface, previously invisible, a network of connected chambers appeared. Corridors, power conduits, defensive emplacements, all dormant, all waiting. The bunker they occupied was not a single shelter. It was the entrance to something vast. She looked at the network with an expression he could not read. Then she turned back to the immediate display and began adjusting the defense nodes with quick, deliberate inputs. "The drones are running a standard triangulation sweep," she said. "They will narrow to this ridge within 20 minutes. The shelter's passive shielding will hold against their scanning frequency, but only if we remain below threshold emission levels." Her voice had changed again. This was briefing voice. Strategic assessment delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had commanded rooms full of people whose lives depended on the accuracy of her analysis. He recognized it because he had heard it before. Not from her, from generals, from the kind of officers who did not raise their voices because they had never needed to. The kind whose quiet sentences moved battalions. "What happens when the drones finish their sweep?" he asked. She did not look at him. "They will call in the recovery asset." "And what is the recovery asset?" "Something worse." As if in answer, a new signal appeared on the terrain map. Farther out than the drones, deeper, a single point of cold light approaching from the east, with the steady deliberation of something that did not rush, because rushing implied the possibility of failure. Saralyn's hands went still on the console. He watched her face. For the first time since the crash, something passed through her expression that held neither control nor calculation. It was recognition, the specific, terrible recognition of someone who knows exactly what is coming because they have seen it before and hope they never would again. "What is that?" he asked. "A retrieval unit," she said. Her voice was quieter now, compressed under a weight she was trying not to let him see. "Autonomous, adaptive alloy construction. No pilot, no crew, No negotiation protocols. It has one function. Let me guess. Retrieval. She almost looked at him. The humor did not land. Whatever she was seeing on that display had taken something from her that jokes could not restore. It will reach this position in approximately 12 minutes, she said. The drones are its eyes. Once they confirm location, it will come directly. The passive shielding will not stop it. It does not scan, it dismantles. He exhaled slowly through his teeth. You know a great deal about this specific piece of military hardware. Yes, because you have encountered it before. Because I authorized its construction. The sentence landed in the bunker like a stone dropped from a great height. He turned fully to face her. She stood at the console with both hands flat on the surface, the holographic light painting her face in blue and silver, and met his gaze with the expression of someone who had just opened a door she could not close again. You authorized it, he repeated. The retrieval unit is a classified asset of the Aetheri Imperial Defense Command, she said. It was designed 11 years ago for the recovery of high-value strategic targets in hostile territory. I approved the design specifications. I allocated the resources. I signed the deployment protocols. She paused. And now it has been sent for me. Silence filled the bunker. The defense nodes clicked softly in the walls, like insects preparing for rain. Who sent it? Beckett asked. And this time his voice carried no humor, no deflection, just the steady tone of a man who understood that the answer to this question would change the shape of everything that followed. Saraline's jaw tightened. The light beneath her skin flared once along her throat like a pulse of heat through cooling metal and faded. Only one person in the Empire holds the authority to deploy the retrieval unit, she said. The Supreme Commander of the Aetheri Military Forces, my most senior advisor. The man who stood beside my throne for 23 years and swore an oath of loyalty so absolute that I built an entire defense doctrine on the foundation of his word. She looked at the approaching signal on the map. The cold light crept closer. His name is Drevin Ashkareth. She said the name the way a person says the name of the dead, with the hollow precision of someone still processing the fact that a pillar they had leaned against for decades had been hollow the entire time. Beckett watched her carefully. He had seen betrayal before, had lived through it himself. He knew the specific mathematics of discovering that trust had been a transaction you did not know you were making. But what he saw on Saraline's face was not the betrayal of a colleague or a friend. It was the betrayal of a daughter by a father. The particular devastation that occurs when the person who taught you to stand is the one who arranged for you to fall. What happened? He asked. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the holographic map, at the approaching signal, at the network of dormant chambers beneath their feet, and he understood that she was not choosing which words to use. She was choosing how much of herself to expose. Every piece of truth she gave him was a weapon he could turn against her, and the last person she had trusted with the full truth was currently sending a machine to harvest her organs. But she told him anyway. And that more than anything else she had done that night told him who she was. I was conducting a diplomatic mission to the outer territories, she said. Routine engagement with allied systems. Ashkaroth remained in command of the defense forces during my absence, as he always did, as he had done 100 times before without incident. Her voice remained level, clinical, the voice of a ruler delivering an after-action report on her own destruction. But beneath the clinical precision, beneath the measured cadence, he could hear the hairline fractures. The places where the words almost broke and were held together by nothing except discipline and the refusal to give her grief an audience. 3 days into the mission, my communications were severed. My escort fleet was redirected. My ship was fired upon by vessels carrying Aetheri military codes. I escaped in a diplomatic shuttle and ran. When the shuttle's systems failed under sustained pursuit, I made a decision. She touched the holographic map. The vast underground network of the bunker complex pulsed faintly beneath her fingertips. I came here, she said, to the one place in the universe where the ground itself knows my blood. The retrieval unit's signal was closer now. 8 minutes, perhaps 7. He staged a coup, Beckett said. It was not a question. He staged a reorganization, she corrected. The terminology matters. A coup implies violence and disorder. Ashkaroth is meticulous. He would have presented it as a necessary transition. Emergency authority assumed in the wake of the Empress's tragic disappearance. Stability maintained. Continuity preserved. Every protocol followed to the letter because he wrote most of those protocols himself, and the retrieval unit sent to ensure the disappearance becomes permanent. She turned from the console and looked at him directly. He does not want me dead, she said. Not yet. He needs what is inside me. The crown node is not merely biological. It is a key. The defense systems of the Aetheri Empire, the old systems, the ones that predate our expansion by millennia, they respond only to the crown node frequency. Without it, Ashkarath commands a modern military. With it, he commands everything. The approaching signal pulsed on the map. 5 minutes. Beckett checked the charge on his plasma cutter, looked at the defense nodes in the walls, looked at the narrow corridors of the bunker complex, looked at the woman standing in the blue light who had just told him that the most powerful military mind in an interstellar empire had decided she was more valuable as components than as a person. All right, he said, so we do not let it take you. She gave him a long look, the kind of look that held gratitude and warning in equal measure. You understand what you are agreeing to. I understand that a machine is coming to rip something out of your body, and I have a plasma cutter and strong feelings about that. Something flickered across her face, something deeper than a smile. The expression of someone who had spent so long surrounded by calculated loyalty that the presence of something unconditional momentarily broke the rhythm of her thinking. Then she straightened. The Empress returned, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight and clarity of a command that expected to be obeyed by the universe itself. Seal the outer corridor, she said. Reroute power from the medical bay to the defense grid. When it enters, I will channel it through the central passage. You will hold the secondary corridor. She looked at him. Do not attempt to fight it directly. The alloy reforms faster than you can damage it. Strike the connection points where the tendrils meet the central mass. That is where the coordination nodes are most vulnerable. He nodded. What will you be doing commanding the defense network? From where? From everywhere. She placed her hand flat against the bunker wall. Where her palm met the ancient surface, the wall responded. Symbols illuminated in cascading sequences. Power routed through conduits that had been dormant since before his species had discovered fire. The defense nodes in the walls oriented simultaneously, tracking an enemy that had not yet arrived with the coordinated patience of a system that had been waiting for exactly this hand to wake it. Something touched the outer door. Not a blast. Not an impact. A soft, deliberate contact. Like knuckles against glass. Like a visitor checking whether anyone was home. The hairs rose on the back of his neck. That is somehow much worse than an explosion, he said. The second touch came with a pulse that ran through the wall and made the ancient symbols along the entry frame flare bright. The bunker's security systems recognized the intrusion protocol being used against them, something far more advanced than anything the shelter had been designed to resist. But they held, for now. Saraline pulled a slim metallic rod from inside her torn sleeve and pressed it into his free hand. It was warm, lighter than it looked, covered in micro-engraved symbols that matched the ones on the walls. He looked at it. You had a weapon this entire time. I had a tool. It unfolds into a blade. Does it not? It unfolds into a smaller tool. That is deeply disappointing. Another pulse hit the door, harder. The ancient metal groaned. The defense nodes began their final calibration, tiny lenses tracking the growing deformation in the entry panel. She stepped close enough that he could see the veins of light beneath her skin, flaring like fault lines in luminous stone, flowing up her neck and across her temples as stresses accelerated whatever biological process powered them. Listen carefully, she said. If the barrier fails, stay behind me. He gave her a flat stare. I am sorry. Did you recently lose a large quantity of blood directly into your judgment? You can barely stand. I can stand long enough. That sentence is not intended to be comforting. It was not intended to be. The outer door screamed. Old metal bent inward. The holographic display glitched and recovered. One defense node fired autonomously, sending a needle-thin beam through the widening seam in the entry panel. Something on the other side answered with a shriek of corrupted static that vibrated in his bones. Then the final lock broke. The entry panel split open by a hand's width, and through the gap he saw it. A shifting column of dark alloy threaded with veins of living light. It pressed against the gap with patient reforming strength. Each time a defense beam struck it, the surface rippled, absorbed and closed. No cockpit, no pilot, no eyes. Just purpose shaped into matter and given permission to never stop. Tell me that is not the retrieval unit, he said. It is. Good. I would hate to learn there was something worse. The alloy mass pushed through the gap with the slow confidence of something that had never once been denied its target. Sarah voice cut through the chamber like a bee. Seal the inner corridor, now. The bunker obeyed, not because as he pressed anything, because she commanded it and the walls listened. Sections of the corridor slammed shut in sequence, dividing the central passage into narrow lanes. The retrieval unit hit the first barrier and tore through it, but the 3-second delay was enough. Sarah had already rerouted power to the secondary defense grid. Beams converged on the thing from 4 angles simultaneously. It shuddered, slowed, did not stop. Sarah directed the fight from the console with one hand on the wall and the other orchestrating the holographic display. She read the retrieval unit's movement patterns in real time and adjusted the defense response with a speed and precision that confirmed she had spent years studying exactly this kind of threat. Because she had helped create it. The secondary corridor, she said. It is sending tendrils to flank. Cut the lead one at the junction node. He moved. The metallic rod was still in his hand. Twist the center, she had said. He twisted. The rod unfolded with a sharp mechanical bloom, extending into a narrow arc of pale energy that hummed so violently his entire arm vibrated. A controlled edge of something that existed between light and force, precise enough to cut molecular bonds and loud enough to make the air itself flinch. His eyes widened. I forgive you completely, he said. A tendril of dark alloy whipped around the corridor junction. He slashed across it at the point where it narrowed, where the coordination fibers were densest. The energy blade cut clean. White sparks burst into the air. The tendril recoiled, severed, thrashing against the walls before going dark. First blood. So it can feel pain, he said. It can feel damage, Sarah corrected from the console. Pain requires awareness. This thing has none. Do not give it the dignity. She hurled a fallen emitter from the floor into the open seam of the corridor behind the retreating tendril. It detonated in a violent burst of blue light that illuminated the entire passage and drove the alloy mass back 3 meters. Keep it away from the central core, she commanded. You say that as though I had a backup hobby planned for this evening. The retrieval unit adapted. It split itself into smaller components, sending multiple tendrils through different corridors, simultaneously testing the defense grid for gaps the way water tests a dam. Sarah tracked each one on the holographic display and redirected defense beams with a focus so absolute that the bunker itself seemed to breathe with her rhythm. Beckett moved through the corridors on her command. She told him where to stand, when to strike, which junction to defend, and which to abandon. He was the sword. She was the general. And in the strange, deadly rhythm of that partnership, he began to understand something about her that rank and title could never have communicated. She was not merely commanding. She was thinking 7 steps ahead of something that had been designed to be unpredictable, and she was winning. The machine sent 2 tendrils through the northern corridor simultaneously. He caught the first one at the junction, severing it clean. The second wrapped around a support column and launched itself toward the central console. Goal. Sarah did not move from her position at the wall. She did not need to. A defense beam fired from a node he had not known was active, catching the tendril mid-flight and pinning it against the ceiling until it burned through its own coordination fibers and fell dark. She had positioned that beam 3 minutes earlier. She had known the machine would try that route. She had known it before the machine did. How are you doing this? He asked between breaths. Doing what? Predicting something that was specifically built to be unpredictable. Everything is predictable if you understand its priorities, she said, adjusting 2 defense beams to cover the eastern corridor. This unit prioritizes the shortest path to the target. When the shortest path is blocked, it generates alternatives using a branching algorithm I helped design. The algorithm has 17 decision layers. I know all 17. There was something terrifying about hearing a woman describe the inner logic of a machine that was trying to dismantle her, using the same calm tone she might use to describe a chess opening she had once favored. Another tendril came from below, pushing through a crack in the floor tiles he had not noticed. It wrapped around his ankle before he could react, and for one very bad second, he felt the alloy tighten with strength that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with engineered purpose. He slashed downward. The blade cut through the tendril at the root and the grip released. His ankle throbbed. He did not have time to think about it. Secondary junctions 3 and 4, Serlin said. It is trying to establish a bridge across the central corridor. If it connects, it will bypass the defense grid entirely. He ran. The corridors blurred around him. He reached junction 3 and found two tendrils weaving together like braided cable, building a structure that looked uncomfortably like a bridge. He cut the first tendril. The second recoiled and reformed. He cut it again. It reformed faster. The machine was learning his rhythm. He stopped trying to match its speed and tried something it would not expect. He lured one tendril toward the medical platform, kicked the support column loose, and sent the entire unit crashing down over the alloy limb. The weight pinned it for 2 seconds, long enough for a defense beam to sever it at the base. Serling glanced at him through the holographic display. That was competent. Please say that again when we are not actively dying. Then she froze. She was staring at the floor where the medical platform had stood, where her blood, the silver-blue luminescent blood that had flowed from her wound during the healing process, had pooled and seeped into the cracks between the ancient stone tiles. The floor was glowing, not the emergency lights, not the defense grid, the floor itself, the stone, the foundation of the bunker. Where her blood had touched it, pale silver light was spreading outward through channels carved so fine they were invisible until they were illuminated. The light traveled through the stone like veins coming alive, reaching into the walls, the ceiling, the deeper corridors, waking something that had been waiting for exactly this catalyst. The entire bunker surged. Defense nodes that had been operating at minimum capacity tripled their output. Corridors that had been dark blazed with light. Systems he had not known existed activated in sequence, each one more powerful than the last. The holographic display expanded to show not just the bunker, but the entire underground network beneath the ridge, and every node in that network was coming online. Serling stared at the spreading light with an expression that held no surprise. What he saw on her face was grief, the specific grief of someone returning to a place they had hoped never to need again. "This is your home," Beckett said quietly. Not a question. She was silent for a long moment. The retrieval unit had stopped advancing. The sudden escalation in the defense grid had driven it back to the entry corridor, where it reformed and waited with the calculating patience of a predator, reassessing its approach. "This world is called Narth 9 in your survey catalog," she said. "In ours, it has a different name. It was the first world, the origin, where the ethery civilization began before we reached the stars, before we built an empire, before we forgot what mattered." Her voice carried something he had not heard in it before, or reverence. The quiet weight of someone speaking about something sacred in a language that did not have adequate words for sacred things. "My people left this world 12,000 years ago," she continued. "They expanded outward, built colonies, established trade routes, eventually an empire. But they never forgot where they came from. Every generation of the ruling bloodline was taught the coordinates of this planet, taught the access codes, taught the resonance frequencies. It was our most closely guarded secret because the first world was not just history, it was insurance. A fail-safe, a place where the bloodline could return if everything else failed." She looked at him. "Everything else has failed," she said. She touched the wall again. The light beneath her skin and the light in the stone pulsed in synchrony, two halves of the same ancient heartbeat, finding each other across millennia. "The defense systems here are not technology in the way you understand it," she said. "They are biological architecture keyed to a specific genetic frequency. My frequency. My bloodline built this place. My ancestors bled into this stone to seal their covenant with it. And when I fled Ashkaroth's betrayal, I did not flee randomly. I came to the one place in the universe that would recognize me, that would protect me, that would wake for me and for no one else." The retrieval unit lunged. It came through the entry corridor in a reformed mass, faster now, denser. It had analyzed the defense grid's patterns during its retreat and was attempting to overwhelm the system through sheer adaptive speed. Caroline did not flinch. She placed both hands against the wall, and the bunker answered with everything it had. Defense beams fired in coordinated volleys. Corridor sections collapsed in precisely timed sequences, crushing tendril after tendril. The ancient systems fought with a fury that felt almost personal, as though the stone itself was angry that someone had dared to threaten the bloodline it had been built to serve. Beckett cut through every tendril that reached the secondary corridors. The energy blades sang in the dark. He was moving faster than he would have believed possible 4 hours ago. Less like a tired surveyor and more like someone who had found in the most absurd and terrifying circumstances imaginable a reason to be exactly where he was. The retrieval unit fought for another 90 seconds. Then the defense grid found its core. 3 beams converged on the central mass simultaneously. The alloy screamed, not static this time, something closer to a voice, a sound that suggested even purpose, when sufficiently damaged, could experience something adjacent to anguish. The mass collapsed. Dark alloy spilled across the corridor floor like liquid shadow twitching, trying to reform, failing. The living light in its veins flickered and went dark. Silence. Beckett leaned against the corridor wall, breathing hard. The energy blade hummed in his hand. His arms shook. His legs shook. Everything shook. Cerilyn stood at the console with both hands still pressed to the wall, the glow that threaded her veins slowly dimming, from blazing to steady. She looked at the dead retrieval unit on the floor the way a woman looks at a letter from someone she once loved. Then the dead thing spoke, not with a voice, with a recording, a final transmission cached in its communication array, triggered by system failure playing automatically as its last act of obedience. The voice that filled the bunker was deep, measured, cultured. The voice of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where his words shaped the fates of billions. Asset status, non-recoverable. Priority override 7. Transmit final coordinates. Extraction protocol, secondary. Crown node retrieval is the primary objective. The vessel is expendable. Repeat. The vessel is expendable. Bring back the node. The body is not required. The recording ended. The bunker was very quiet. Beckett looked at Cerilyn. She had not moved. Her hands were still on the wall. Her eyes were open, but focused on nothing in the room. She was looking at something far away and interior, something that had just broken inside her with a sound only she could hear. He knew that voice, he said carefully. Yes, Ashgaroth, yes, he called you expendable. She closed her eyes. The luminescence woven through her veins pulsed once slowly like a heartbeat that was deciding whether to continue. He called me a vessel, she said. The word carried a weight that went beyond language, beyond insult. It was the reduction of a living being, a ruler, a woman who had built and protected and sacrificed into a container, a delivery mechanism for the thing inside her that was more valuable than she was. In that one word, Ashgaroth had revealed everything. Not just his plan, but his perspective. He did not see her as a person he had betrayed. He saw her as a resource he had seized. The 23 years of counsel, of trust, of standing beside her throne and speaking her name with what she had believed was respect, all of it had been inventory management. He had been waiting not for the right moment to strike, but for the right moment to collect. He watched her face. He did not speak. Some moments did not need words. They needed witness. And Beckett Gray, who had spent years avoiding the witnessing of anything that might require him to feel something, stood in the blue light of an ancient bunker and bore witness to the full cost of a betrayal that spanned decades and species and the cold distance between stars. She was quiet for a long time. The medical system hummed. The defense nodes clicked, softly. Outside, somewhere far above them, engines were approaching, and the decision tree of what happened next was branching in directions that grew darker with every passing minute. Then she opened her eyes, and something had changed. The grief was still there. The betrayal was still there. But rising through them now, the way heat rises through stone that has absorbed too much sun, was something else entirely. Something that made the air in the bunker feel thinner, colder, more aware. He had seen anger before. He had seen rage. He had seen the wild, destructive fury of men who had lost control and the controlled, destructive fury of men who had chosen to lose it. What he saw in Cerilyn Voss was neither of those things. It was older. It was colder. It was the fury of someone who had been patient for a very long time and had just decided that patience was no longer a virtue, but a liability. Cold, absolute imperial fury. She lifted her hands from the wall, straightened her spine, raised her chin, and in that motion, the wounded woman he had carried across 6 kilometers of dead rock completed a transformation that he understood with sudden and total clarity had been building since the moment he found her in the wreck. She had been surviving. Now she was deciding. The retrieval unit transmitted our coordinates before it died, she said. Her voice was level, precise, made of steel and starlight. Ashkaroth will come himself. He will bring his fleet. He will expect to find me broken. She turned to face Beckett. The light inside her was building now, rising, filling her eyes until they shone with a luminescence that felt older than the stone surrounding them. He will be wrong, she said. Beckett looked at the dead machine on the floor, looked at the glowing walls, looked at the woman standing in the center of the oldest room he had ever entered, burning from within with a light that predated his entire civilization. What do we do, he asked. The smile that crossed her face held neither warmth nor humor. It was the smile of a queen who had just finished mourning and started planning. Now, she said, we end this. By the time Sherlin finished preparing the bunker systems, 17 minutes had passed, and Beckett's understanding of competence had been dismantled and rebuilt from the foundation. She had moved through the ancient consoles while he was still catching his breath from the retrieval unit fight, her hands never hesitating, each interface responding to her touch as though it had been holding its breath for centuries. She activated communication arrays buried so deep in the stone that his scanner could not detect them. She rerouted power through conduits that predated every civilization his species had ever studied. She brought dormant monitoring systems online one by one, and each one expanded the holographic display above the central console until the map showed not just the canyon, not just the ridge, but the entire hemisphere of Narth 9 rendered in pale blue light. And scattered across that hemisphere, pulsing faintly like embers beneath ash, were structures. Hundreds of them. Thousands. An entire planetary network of defense installations, communication relays, orbital weapon platforms, and shield generators, all dormant, all connected, waiting for the same thing the bunker had been waiting for. Her blood, her frequency, her command. Beckett stood at the edge of the holographic display and watched the scope of it expand beyond anything he had the framework to process. How long has all of this been here, he asked. She did not look up from the console. Longer than your species has had language. And no one knew. Everyone who needed to know is dead, or was supposed to be. She paused over a communication interface. Her fingers hovered above the symbols. For the first time in several minutes, her hands were trembling. Not from weakness, from the weight of what she was about to do. There is someone I need to contact, she said. Someone I trust. If she is still alive. If Ashkareth would have moved against my inner circle immediately. Standard doctrine for consolidating a seizure of power. Eliminate loyalty before it can organize. I wrote that doctrine, she added quietly. 20 years ago. I never imagined it would be used against me. She placed her palm flat against the communication array. The crown node in her chest brightened visibly through her torn clothing, a warm silver-white glow that pulsed in rhythm with something deep beneath the stone. The array responded with resonance, a frequency that traveled through the planet's crust itself, encoded in a biological signature that no technology could replicate or intercept. Because it was not technology, it was inheritance. Who are you calling? Beckett asked. Marin Kyle, she said, captain of my personal guard. The only officer in the Empire whose loyalty I never had to purchase, negotiate, or assume. She closed her eyes. The signal went out. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then faintly, the array pulsed back. A response, distant, fragmented, but real. Serlin exhaled, a sound he had not heard from her before. Something close to the sound a person makes when they discover that the last bridge has not yet burned. She is alive, Serlin said. Good. Can she reach us? She is already moving. But she is far, hours at best. We may not have hours. No, Serlin agreed. We may not. Then the first tremor hit. This was deeper than drones, heavier than a retrieval unit. The kind of sound that traveled through stone and settled in the bones and told every survival instinct in the human body that something very large was very close and did not care who knew it. The holographic display updated. Beckett watched the new signatures appear above the canyon and felt his throat tighten. Ships. A full military formation larger than anything the drones had suggested. 17 vessels holding position above the ridge in a pattern he recognized from his own service, a containment grid designed to ensure that nothing on the ground left the ground without permission. Their hulls carried the same elegant geometry as Saraline's crashed shuttle, the same dark violet and shifting silver, the same technology that seemed unable to decide whether it wanted to be seen. But these were not diplomatic vessels. These were warships. And at the center of the formation, larger than the rest, sat a command carrier whose silhouette against the twin moons looked less like a ship and more like a cathedral designed by someone who believed that intimidation was an art form. Ashgaroth Saraline said. She was looking at the display with an expression that held both recognition and resolution, the face of someone seeing an old wound for the last time before deciding to close it permanently. Then the voice came, not through the bunker systems, through every active circuit in the chamber simultaneously, as though the speaker had the authority to commandeer any technology within range simply by choosing to speak. The voice was deep, cultured, patient, the voice of a man who had spent 50 years learning that power sounded best when it whispered to the human in the structure below. Beckett straightened. My name is Drevin Ashgaroth, Supreme Commander of the Etheri Imperial Defense Forces. I am addressing you directly because I believe you are a reasonable man caught in circumstances beyond your understanding. The voice paused. The pause of a man selecting each word the way a surgeon selects instruments. The woman you are sheltering is not who she claims to be. She is a former authority figure currently under investigation for catastrophic failures in governance that resulted in the deaths of thousands across 3 star systems. She is dangerous. She is unstable. And she is using you. Beckett looked at Saraline. She stood perfectly still. She did not interrupt. She did not shake her head. She did not plead. She simply watched him with those luminous eyes and waited. There was no defense in her posture, no preparation for argument. She stood the way a person stands in front of a jury that has already heard the prosecution and is waiting to see whether the truth needs a lawyer or whether it can speak for itself. I am prepared to offer you full diplomatic protection. Ashgaroth continued. Safe passage to any system of your choosing. Financial compensation sufficient to fund a comfortable life for the remainder of your years. All I require is that you step away from the bunker's defense systems and allow my personnel to enter peacefully. No one needs to be harmed today. This can end quietly. He paused again, and then with the practiced warmth of a man who understood that the most effective manipulation always sounds like kindness. I understand what it looks like from where you stand. A wounded woman, armed pursuers, the instinct to protect. I respect that instinct. It speaks well of you. But instinct without information is how good men make catastrophic mistakes. Let me give you the information. Let me help you make the right choice. The voice fell silent. The offer hung in the air like smoke. Beckett stood in the blue light of the holographic display and felt the weight of the decision settle onto his shoulders with physical force. Not because the offer was tempting. The money meant nothing. The safe passage meant less. But because the voice was good. Ashgaroth was very, very good. He spoke with the measured concern of a man trying to prevent tragedy. He spoke with the weary patience of someone who had seen too many conflicts escalate unnecessarily. He spoke like every commanding officer Beckett had ever trusted before learning that trust was the first thing they spent. He spoke the way Lieutenant Colonel Ferris had spoken at Fort Huachuca 3 days before Ferris signed the order that sent 11 men into a situation that 7 of them did not come back from, with exactly that same tone. The tone that said, I am the reasonable one here. The tone that said, trust me and I will make this simple for you. And for one moment, a single honest moment that he would not deny later because denying it would be a lie, Beckett hesitated. Not because he believed Ashgaroth, but because the architecture of the lie was so well built that disbelief required effort, required choosing the harder interpretation, required looking at the wounded woman standing 5 feet away and deciding that what he had seen with his own eyes mattered more than what a persuasive voice was telling him from the safety of a warship. He thought about the recording. The vessel is expendable. Bring back the node. The body is not required. That was the real voice. The one that spoke when it believed no one was listening. The broadcast was the performance. The recording was the man. Saralene watched him hesitate. She saw it. He knew she saw it. And she did not flinch, did not look away, did not offer a counter-argument or an emotional appeal or a single word designed to tip the scale. She simply said, "You have seen who ran, and you have seen who sent machines to kill." 9 words, no desperation, no manipulation, just the quiet precision of someone who understood that the truth should not need to shout to be heard. Beckett looked at the holographic display. 17 warships, a containment grid, a fleet commanded by a man who called the woman beside him expendable, and meant it. Then he looked at Saralyn, who had bled on his back for 6 kilometers without complaint, who had guided him through terrain she should not have known, who had turned a dead bunker into a fortress and fought beside him against a machine she had helped create, who had not once in all the hours since he found her asked him to believe her, only to observe. He reached over and shut off the external communication channel. The silence that followed was louder than Ashkarath's voice had been. It was the silence of a door closing, the silence of a man who had just chosen a side in a war he did not understand on a planet he had not asked to visit for a woman he had known for less than 6 hours. He had made decisions like this before. In the military, in the field, in the split-second arithmetic of combat, where the variables were always incomplete and the stakes were always permanent. But those decisions had been made inside a structure, inside a chain of command that told him which direction to point the risk. This decision had no structure, no orders, no framework except the accumulated evidence of one evening and the quality of 2 voices. One voice had called her expendable. The other had not asked him to stay. "I have made poor decisions," he said, "but never one I was more certain about." Something moved across her face. Fast, almost invisible. If he had blinked, he would have missed it. But he did not blink, and what he saw in that fraction of a second was not gratitude and not relief. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying the weight of absolute solitude for so long that the sudden presence of someone standing beside her by choice, rather than obligation, caused a fracture in a wall she had spent years reinforcing. She turned back to the console before the fracture could widen. But the fracture was there, and they both knew that walls with fractures do not hold the same way they did before, no matter how carefully they are maintained. "He will send ground forces now," she said. Her voice was steady again. The Empress had returned. "He cannot risk orbital bombardment. The planetary defense network is partially active. If he fires from orbit, the network may interpret it as an attack on the bloodline and escalate autonomously. He does not understand these systems well enough to predict the response. So he will come through the corridors. How many soldiers enough to fill them?" Beckett checked the energy blade. Still charged, still humming, still the most absurd weapon a man had ever carried into a battle he had no business fighting. "And your plan?" he asked. Saralyn looked at the holographic map. The underground network pulsed beneath them in layers of ancient architecture that descended far deeper than the bunker they occupied. At the very bottom, at the center of the network, a single point glowed brighter than everything else. "A core, the heart of the system." She pointed to it. "We go down," she said, "into the planet, into the foundation. The original power core, built by the first generation of my bloodline. Every system on this world, every defense platform, every orbital installation, they are all connected to that core. And the core responds to one thing," Crown Node Beckett said. She nodded. "If I reach it, I can activate the full planetary defense network, not the fragments we have been using. Everything. Satellites that have been dormant since before your species built its first city. Orbital platforms capable of disabling an entire fleet without firing a single destructive shot. Shield arrays that can seal this world against any incursion. And Ashkarath's fleet will be neutralized," she said. "Disabled. Grounded. Every system aboard every vessel will answer to the core, because every system aboard every vessel was built on technology derived from this world. From this stone, from my blood." She looked at him. "But I need time to reach it, and Ashkarath's soldiers will be in these corridors before I am halfway there." Beckett understood. She did not need to say it. The math was simple. Someone needed to hold the corridors while she descended to the core. Someone needed to stand between an advancing army and a woman walking into the heart of a dead planet to wake it up. He adjusted his grip on the energy blade, raised it slightly, watched the pale light reflect off the ancient walls. You know, he said yesterday my biggest problem was a missing survey beacon. She almost smiled. I have made your life more interesting. That is one word for it. The first explosion hit the outer door, not the careful probing of the retrieval unit. Raw force, breaching charges designed to remove obstacles rather than study them. The door that had survived millennia of silence blew inward in a cascade of ancient metal and modern violence. Saralyn was already moving. She descended into the lower quarters with a speed that defied her injuries, one hand trailing along the wall, the stone lighting up beneath her touch in cascading waves that illuminated the path ahead of her, as though the planet itself was guiding her home. Beckett turned to face the breach. Armored figures poured through the shattered doorway. Ethery soldiers, disciplined, moving in formations that spoke of training so thorough it had become instinct. Their weapons were elegant and devastating. Their armor carried the dark violet of Ashkaroth's command fleet. They advanced through the corridors with the mechanical efficiency of men who had been told their target was a criminal and had no reason to question the order. He activated the defense grid from the console Saralyn had configured. She had left it ready for him, pre-programmed, targeted, every beam calibrated, every corridor section mapped. All he had to do was execute the sequence she had designed, and the bunker became a gauntlet. Defense beams fired in coordinated patterns, corridor sections sealed and opened in rhythm, channeling the advancing soldiers into kill zones where the ancient weapons could concentrate their fire. The Etheri armor was strong, the beams were stronger, not because the technology was more advanced, but because it was more fundamental. Deeper, built into the bones of the world by people who had understood that true defense was not a system, but a covenant. He held the secondary corridor with the energy blade, not fighting an army, fighting time, buying minutes for a woman descending into the dark below him. Each minute cost him something: energy, focus, the slowly diminishing charge of a weapon that had not been designed for sustained combat. The first wave came through the breach in disciplined pairs. He activated the defense sequence Saralyn had programmed and watched the corridor become a gauntlet of timed beams and closing walls. The soldiers were good. They adapted quickly, using their armor to absorb glancing hits and pushing through the kill zones with the coordinated efficiency of troops who had trained for exactly this kind of confined engagement. But the ancient defense grid was better. It did not need to kill them. It needed to slow them. And the narrow corridors of a bunker designed by a civilization that had perfected defensive architecture thousands of years before these soldiers were born gave the grid every advantage. He caught a soldier who made it through the first barrier with a sweeping cut from the energy blade. The arc of pale light connected with the dark violet armor and sent the soldier stumbling backward. The blade did not cut through ethery armor the way it cut through alloy tendrils, but it transferred enough force to make them think twice about advancing. And thinking twice in a corridor where defense beams fired every 3 seconds was usually enough. The second wave was larger. 6 soldiers moving in a staggered formation designed to absorb the defense beam timing. 2 fell to the grid. 2 retreated. 2 made it close enough that Beckett could see the reflection of his own exhausted face in their helmets. He fought them with the energy blade, and 4 years of muscle memory from combat training he had tried very hard to forget. The blade was not a sword. It was not a gun. It was something in between, an arc of energy that required him to commit to each swing, because the slight delay before the blade reformed meant that every miss left him exposed. He learned its rhythm. He learned the half-second pause. He learned that the Etheri soldiers were trained to advance in pairs, and that separating them was more effective than fighting them together. He held the corridor. A third wave came. Larger still, he activated the secondary defense sequence, and 3 corridor sections sealed simultaneously, buying him 30 seconds to catch his breath and check the blade's charge. It was at 40%, enough for another 10 minutes of sustained use, maybe 15 if he was careful. He had never been particularly careful. Below, far below, Saralyn Voss was descending. She moved through corridors that grew older with every step. The walls changed as she went deeper. The precisely cut stone of the upper levels gave way to rougher surfaces, more organic, as though the architects had been working closer to the living rock and had not yet learned to impose their geometry upon it. The silver veins in the stone grew denser, thicker, pulsing with increasing intensity as she approached the center. They responded to her presence the way a river responds to gravity flowing toward her, brightening where she walked, dimming where she had passed. Her wound had sealed, but the pain remained a constant low fire along her left side that she managed the way she managed everything by deciding it was acceptable and moving forward. The crown node in her chest pulsed with increasing warmth, resonating with the stone around her, communicating in a language that predated speech. She could feel the core ahead of her. She had always been able to feel it the way a person born near the ocean can always feel the tide. It was part of her. She was part of it. Sherfontan. The distance between them was a temporary condition that the universe had never been comfortable with. The deepest corridor opened into a passage carved not by tools, but by the patient application of the bloodline's frequency over generations. Her ancestors had walked this path. They had pressed their hands against these walls and let their biology sing to the stone until the stone parted. She placed her own hand against the surface now and felt the faint vibration of 1,000 years of accumulated memory humming back against her palm. She emerged into the core chamber. It was circular, the ceiling lost in darkness above, the walls carved with symbols that predated written language and communicated meaning through geometry alone. She had been here once before as a child brought by her grandmother to stand in the center of the chamber and listen. Her grandmother had placed her small hand against the core and said, "This is who we are. This is what we protect. And everything else is negotiation." She had not understood then. She understood now. At the center of the chamber stood the core itself, a column of crystallized stone that rose from the floor like a monument to the planet's own heartbeat, threaded with the same silver veins that ran beneath her skin. It had been dark for thousands of years, waiting for the specific frequency that would bring it back, waiting for the specific blood, waiting for her. She walked to it, placed both hands against its surface, closed her eyes. The crown node in her chest responded, immediately, completely. Light blazed from beneath her skin so brightly that for a moment she appeared to be made entirely of it. The glow traveled down her arms, through her palms, into the crystallized stone. The core absorbed it like dry earth absorbing rain. Then it ignited. Light erupted through the column and raced outward through every vein in the stone, through the floor, through the walls, through the corridors where Beckett fought, through the surface of the planet, through the crust, through dormant relay stations buried in mountains and beneath oceans that had dried up before humanity existed. The effect was immediate and absolute. In the corridors above, Beckett felt it before he saw it. The floor beneath his feet vibrated with a frequency that was not mechanical but biological. The walls brightened, the defense beams intensified. Every ancient system in the bunker surged with power that had not been there a second ago. And for one disorienting moment, he had the sensation of standing inside a living thing that had just taken its first breath in 1,000 years. Below him, below the bunker, below the layers of stone and architecture and accumulated silence, a planet was waking up. Across the hemisphere, one by one, the ancient systems came online. Orbital platforms powered up in silence, their weapons arrays orienting toward the fleet above with the quiet precision of eyes opening after a long sleep. Shield generators activated in overlapping layers, sealing the airspace above the canyon, and then expanding outward across the continent in concentric rings of invisible force. Satellite networks that had been orbiting dark and dormant for millennia began broadcasting on frequencies that made every piece of ethereal technology within range pause, stutter, and listen. Because the technology recognized the frequency, it had been born from it. Every ship in Ashkarath's fleet, every weapon, every navigation system, every piece of communication equipment, and all of it had been built on principles derived from this world, from this stone, from the bloodline that had first learned to make matter respond to intention. The technology was sophisticated, it was powerful, and it had just received an instruction from the source of its own existence that superseded every command its current operators could give. Aboard the command carrier, every system flickered. Navigation failed. Weapons locked. Communications scrambled. 17 warships went dark simultaneously, suspended in orbit by momentum alone, powerless as the planet below them remembered who it belonged to. Ashkaroth's voice came one final time, a private channel broken and desperate, cutting through the interference with the raw force of a man who understood that he was witnessing the collapse of everything he had built. Saraline, you cannot do this. The Empire needs stability. It needs order. It needs its Empress, she said, and her voice was no longer confined to the bunker. The core carried it. Every system on the planet carried it. Every soldier in the corridors heard it. Every crew member aboard every ship heard it. Calm, clear, absolute. The voice of a sovereign addressing her domain from its oldest and most sacred throne. Stand down. In the corridors above the Aetheri, soldiers stopped. Not because the defense grid forced them, not because their weapons failed, because they heard her. They heard the frequency beneath the words. The crown node resonance that their biology recognized at a level deeper than training, deeper than loyalty to any commander, deeper than thought itself. The resonance of the bloodline their civilization had been built to serve. It was not a choice. It was not obedience. It was something older than either. The way a compass needle turns north. The way a current follows gravity. The way every cell in a body responds to the signal that says this is the center and everything else orbits. One by one they lowered their weapons, some of them slowly as though waking from a dream they had not known they were in. Some of them immediately with the sharp clarity of soldiers who had just realized they had been fighting on the wrong side and wanted the record to show they had stopped the moment they understood. Beckett stood in the secondary quarter energy blade still raised, breathing hard, and watched an army choose its allegiance in real time. He had seen soldiers surrender before. He had seen them lay down weapons at the end of campaigns that had lasted months. But he had never seen anything like this. This was not surrender. This was recognition. The sudden collective understanding of an entire military force that the authority they had been serving was counterfeit, and the real thing was standing below them in a room made of starlight and stone. Then the sky above the canyon filled with light. New ships, emerging from beyond the system's edge with the controlled urgency of a cavalry that had been riding hard for hours. Smaller than Ashkaroth's warships, but moving in tighter formation. Faster, more precise. Their hulls carried no violet markings. They carried silver and white, the colors of the Imperial Guard. Marin Kale's voice cut through every channel simultaneously. Aetheri Imperial Guard to all vessels. By order of Empress Saraline Voss, first of the bloodline, keeper of the crown. Node Sovereign of the Aetheri Accord, you are commanded to surrender all weapons systems and submit to immediate detention. Any vessel that fails to comply will be disabled by planetary defense. She paused. Commander Ashkaroth, you are charged with high treason against the throne. Do not make this more difficult than your dignity can afford. There was no response from the command carrier. No defiant speech, no last stand. In the end, the man who had orchestrated the most ambitious betrayal in Aetheri history could not find a single word to say when the woman he had betrayed stood at the heart of the world he had forgotten and spoke with a voice that made his entire fleet kneel. The silence was its own verdict. The corridor fell silent. Beckett lowered the blade. The ancient walls hummed around him with a sound that felt less like technology and more like satisfaction, the deep contentment of something old that had fulfilled the purpose it was built for. He made his way down through the corridors, following the silver light in the stone descending through layers of architecture that told the story of a civilization in reverse. The deepest chambers, the oldest walls, the place where everything began. He found her standing at the core. The light had dimmed from its initial blaze to a steady warm glow that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Soldiers surrounded the chamber, Marin Kyle's guard, silver-white armor, weapons at rest, every face turned toward the woman at the center. They were kneeling, every one of them. The involuntary submission of people who had found something they thought they had lost and could not process the relief through any motion except surrender. He understood it now. He understood all of it. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the way every system on this planet responded to her touch as though she were not a user, but a part of the machine itself. The security code she had guessed was not a guess. The medical console she had navigated was not intuition. The defense grid she had commanded the retrieval unit, she had outmaneuvered the communication array she had activated with a biological frequency that traveled through the crust of a planet, None of it was resourcefulness. It was inheritance. She was not a traveler stranded on a dead world. She was the reason the world existed at all. Cereline stood with one hand still resting on the core and the other pressed lightly against the wound on her side. Silver hair loose around her shoulders. Her body glowing in slow, steady rhythm, synchronized with the ancient stone. Her posture was not triumphant. She stood the way a person stands when they have finally stopped running and discovered that the ground beneath their feet will hold. She gave a single nod, as though fleets and armies and the salvation of empires were ordinary delays in the schedule of a woman who had always known she would end up exactly here. Beckett stopped at the edge of the chamber. He was covered in dust and dried alien blood that was not his own. The energy blade was nearly depleted. His legs had not stopped shaking since the corridor fight. He looked like a man who had been dragged backward through a war that was several sizes too large for him. But he was standing, and he was here. Ceraline's eyes found him across the chamber. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The chamber hummed with the deep resonance of the core. The kneeling soldiers waited. The holographic displays showed a planet reborn and a fleet in chains. And in the center of it all, the Empress and the Surveyor looked at each other across the full width of everything that had happened between them, and everything that had not been said, and everything that did not need to be. Empress Marin Kyle said, stepping forward, her helmet retracted, revealing a sharp-featured woman in her 40s with the expression of someone who had been professionally worried for too long and was not entirely finished. The trader's fleet has been disabled. All vessels are in custody. Ashkareth himself has been detained aboard the command carrier. The court is secure. We feared I know what you feared, Cereline said. Her gaze did not leave Beckett. This human ensured you were wrong. Every eye in the chamber shifted to him. Hours ago, that scrutiny would have unsettled him. Now he was too exhausted to care about anything except the fact that he was still breathing and the floor was not currently trying to kill him. Just to be absolutely clear, he said, gesturing vaguely at the soldiers, the kneeling guard, the ancient core, the holographic displays showing an entire planet's defense network responding to a single woman's heartbeat. All of this was chasing you. Not all, the Empress replied. Some of it was trying to save me. That does very little for my peace of mind. A laugh escaped her then. Quiet but real. Not the controlled sound of a ruler managing her image. The unguarded sound of a woman who had endured something terrible and survived it, and found at the far end of survival someone who made her laugh, not because he was trying to impress her, but because he genuinely could not help himself. The sound changed her face, softened the geometry that command had carved into it. For a moment, she was not the last empress of the oldest bloodline in a civilization that spanned stars. She was the woman from the wreck, sharp-tongued, stubborn, the one who had mocked him while bleeding and directed a battle while barely able to stand. The medical officers moved in. The soldiers secured the chamber. Marin Kale began issuing orders with the clipped efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this moment and intended to execute it flawlessly. Through the corridors above, through the shattered doorway and the broken ridge, Beckett could see the sky. Ashkareth's dark fleet hung motionless in orbit, dead and drifting. Kyle's silver-white ships moved among them in precise formation, collecting, securing, dismantling the architecture of a betrayal that had almost succeeded. And beyond them, visible now through the cleared atmosphere, the ancient orbital platforms held their positions like guardians who had woken from a long dream and were quietly satisfied with what they found. He should have felt small beneath that sky. He did not. Cereline stepped away from the core and walked toward him. Even surrounded by guards by the machinery of imperial power reassembling itself around her in real time, she did not seem farther away. As though the restoration of her authority had not added distance but removed the last barrier between who she was and who she allowed herself to be. You carried me when you had no reason to, she said. You stood your ground without knowing my name. In my world, entire houses speak of loyalty and fail its first test. You did not. He rubbed the back of his neck. The gesture felt absurd in the context. A man covered in alien dust making a sheepish human motion in front of a kneeling army. But he did it anyway because he was still beneath everything that had happened, a man from Tucson who did not know what to do with sincerity delivered at this scale. Well, he said, in my defense I make poor decisions very quickly. She studied his face. So I noticed. She turned to Marin Kyle and spoke in a voice that carried quiet command. The captain produced a sealed case from within her armor. Inside, resting on a lining of dark material that absorbed light, lay a device unlike anything Beckett had ever seen. Compact, beautiful, a fusion of silver crystal and dark metal so refined that it seemed less like technology and more like a thought that had been given physical form by someone who believed that precision was the highest form of respect. Serling lifted it from the case and placed it in his hand. It was warm. It vibrated faintly against his palm. Not mechanical vibration, resonance, as though it was responding to the fact that it was being held. A charter beacon, she said. Imperial access. Safe passage through any etheric-controlled system. Direct communication rights to my court. No authority in the coalition will obstruct you. No contract agency will ignore your claim. No one will look at you and see a man without standing ever again. He stared at it, turned it over in his hand. Watched the silver crystal catch the light from the core and refract it into patterns that shifted each time he changed the angle. You are giving me a diplomatic artifact, he said, because I was too stubborn to walk away. I am giving it to you, she said, because history should occasionally reward the correct person. He wanted to say something meaningful, something worthy of the moment in the chamber and the woman who stood in front of him wearing the weight of a civilization on her shoulders like it was a coat she had put on 1,000 times. But meaning had always been difficult for him. He had spent too many years in places where sincerity was a liability, and the men who expressed it most fluently were usually the ones who meant it least. So instead he held the beacon and let its warmth settle against his palm and said the only honest thing he could find. Thank you, he said. 2 words, no performance, no pretension. Just the plain gratitude of a man who understood that he had been given something far larger than an artifact and was not entirely sure he deserved it. Something shifted in her expression, a softening so slight that anyone else would have missed it. But he had spent the last several hours reading her face for information that could keep them both alive, and he saw it clearly. The Empress, the commander, the sovereign of the Ethereal Accord, she was still there. But beneath her, visible for one unguarded moment, was the woman. The one who had been alone in a shuttle when the communications went dark. The one who had felt Ashgareth's betrayal like a blade between the ribs. The one who had decided in the worst moment of her life to fly toward the only place that might remember her name. She had survived not because she was powerful, but because she was precise. Because she thought clearly when everything burned. Because she had looked at catastrophe and chosen not to be consumed by it, but to move through it with the focused determination of someone who believed that surrender was a failure of imagination. He recognized that quality. He had carried it himself once before its cynicism had convinced him to put it down. He looked at the beacon, then at the ancient walls, then at the sky full of ships above a planet that had been dead until tonight and was now more alive than anything in the sector. Yesterday he had been a man drifting from contract to contract, avoiding meaning because meaning always arrived with chains. Avoiding connection because connection required trust, and trust required believing that someone somewhere was worth the risk of being wrong about. He had built a life on the principle that expecting nothing was the only reliable strategy. That solitude was not loneliness, but efficiency. That the hollowness he carried was not emptiness, but freedom. But somewhere between the wreck and the bunker, between the weight of her on his back and the sound of her voice directing him through the dark, between the moment he hesitated and the moment he chose, something had shifted inside him that he could not shift back. Not into heroism. He still distrusted that word. It belonged to men who wrote their own citations and believed their own speeches. What had shifted was simpler and older. The understanding that a man's life is not defined by the things he survives, but by the moments when he chooses without payment, without orders, without any guarantee of return to matter. He had spent years surviving. Tonight he had chosen something harder. Serling held out her hand, not for ceremony, not for protocol, for farewell. The specific farewell of 2 people who understood that they had shared something that could not be replicated or continued, but would not be forgotten. He took it. Her grip was firm. Her skin was warm. The light beneath it pulsed once against his palm, faint and steady, like the last word of a sentence she did not need to finish. Next time he said, "Try not to crash on my planet." Her eyes held his. Silver light moved behind them like constellations rearranging themselves into new patterns. Next time she replied, "Walk faster." Then she released his hand and turned toward the corridor. Marin Kael fell into step beside her. The Imperial Guard rose from their knees and formed around her in rings of silver-white armor and disciplined silence. The ancient core pulsed behind them, casting long shadows through the deepest chamber on the oldest world as the last Empress of the Etheri bloodline walked back into the machinery of power that had tried to consume her and had failed. She did not look back. She did not need to. The soldiers withdrew. The ships above reconfigured their formations with impossible efficiency, shifting from containment grid to escort pattern in minutes. The damaged fleet was towed. The orbital platforms adjusted their positions. The planetary defense network remained active, humming with quiet authority, guarding a world that had remembered what it was built for. Within the hour, the canyon began to empty. The sky cleared. The twin moons emerged from behind the dissipating engine trails and cast their fading light across black stone and crystal spines in the scar where a ship had crashed and changed the course of an empire. Beckett Gray stood at the entrance of the bunker and watched the last of the silver-white ships rise above the ridge and vanish into the dark between the stars. The charter beacon rested in his pocket, warm against his hip, humming faintly, alive. Around him, the ruins of Narth 9 glowed with residual light. The silver lines in the ancient stone pulsed, slowly fading now that the blood that had awakened them was departing, but not going dark entirely. As if the planet, having been reminded that it was not forgotten, had decided to stay a little more awake than before. He stood there for a long time. The wind hissed through the crystal spines. The air was thin and dry and tasted like ozone and old stone and something else that he could not name but would never forget. He thought about his father, who had worked at the rail yard in Tucson for 31 years and had never once complained about the heat or the hours or the fact that the world had not become what he had been promised. His father had believed in simple things. Show up, do the work, help the person next to you. Do not wait to be asked. Beckett had spent years trying to outrun that simplicity. He had joined the military to find something larger. He had left the military when the larger thing turned out to be smaller than the simple thing his father had understood all along. He had drifted into contract work because it required nothing of him except competence, and competence was the one quality he could provide without risk. But tonight, on a dead planet at the edge of nowhere, he had done something his father would have understood perfectly. He had seen someone in trouble. He had helped. He had not asked for a reason and had not waited for permission and had not calculated the cost until the cost was already paid. And the cost had been worth it. But because for the first time in years, the hollow place inside him where purpose used to live did not feel hollow anymore. It felt like a room that someone had walked through and left a light burning in. He turned and walked back toward his shuttle, 2 kilometers west, half buried in a ravine, waiting with the patient indifference of a machine that did not care whether its pilot had spent the evening running routine scans or rewriting the political structure of an interstellar civilization. His boots scraped against black stone, the same sound they had made at the beginning of the night when his biggest problem was a missing survey beacon and his most pressing concern was whether the universe held a personal grudge against him. He was still dusty, still tired, still alone on a dead planet at the edge of nowhere. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, the solitude did not feel like a verdict. It felt like a clearing, a space where something new could be built by a man who had finally stopped running from the possibility that building was worth the risk. He reached the shuttle, climbed inside, sat in the pilot's seat and stared at the console for a full minute before starting the pre-flight sequence. The beacon hummed in his pocket. He thought about her, the woman not the Empress or the Sovereign, the one who had said you took your time with a voice that was steady despite the blood, the one who had criticized his pace while being carried across 6 kilometers of murderous rock, the one who had not asked him to believe her, but had simply presented herself as evidence and trusted him to draw the correct conclusion. She had trusted him. That was the thing that kept circling back. In a life defined by betrayal, in a moment when the man she trusted most had sent a machine to remove her organs, she had looked at a stranger with a survey tool and decided that he was worth the risk of honesty. He did not know what to do with that kind of trust. He had not been trained for it. Nothing in his military career or his contract work or his long years of solitude had prepared him for the specific challenge of being trusted by someone who had every reason not to trust anyone ever again. But he knew one thing. He knew that he would not waste it. Somewhere out there, past the twin moons and the crystal ridges, in the vast cold architecture of interstellar space, an empress was returning to her throne. An empire was recalibrating around the fact of her survival. A traitor was learning that the cost of underestimating the woman he had served was measured in everything he would lose. And a man from Tucson was sitting in a survey shuttle on a planet that had been dead for longer than human history, holding proof that he had mattered to someone who mattered to everyone, and trying to decide what to do with a life that had just become against every expectation and every instinct worth living deliberately. He started the engines. The shuttle lifted off the black stone and rose above the canyon, above the ridge, above the ruins that still glowed faintly with silver light in the dark below. He set a course for the relay station at the system's edge. From there, he would file his survey report, collect his payment, consider his options with a clarity he had not possessed 12 hours ago. The stars waited above him, the same stars that had watched him arrive on North 9 as a man with nothing to prove and no one to prove it to. They looked different now, not because they had changed, because he had.